Hey out there, sci-fi fans. It's time yet again for another video about a franchise I find particularly fascinating, that being Star Trek. It's been a while since I made a good in-depth Star Trek video. Today's the day, so we're gonna jet set into the 23rd or 24th century. I forget which it is. I guess one's original series, one's next gen. Whatever. We're going to jetpack on into the future here, and we're going to discuss one of the most interesting aspects of the Star Trek franchise, that being my favorite Star Trek captain, Captain Christopher Pike, played by Jeffrey Hunter. So let's get into it. Apologies if my voice is a little weird during the course of this review, but one of my ears seems blocked up, and as a result the anechoic tube going down to my throat is sort of defective. But we'll make it through nonetheless. So, Captain Christopher Pike is what I want to talk about today. I don't think I've really mentioned Captain Pike in too many other videos, but yes, Captain Pike is my favorite Star Trek captain. I have to say, the more I go back and rewatch The Cage, and the more I see Jeffrey Hunter in other stuff, such as the episode of the Alfred Hitchcock Hour, Don't Look Behind You, where he's really fantastic, or The Searchers, or King of Kings, I'm convinced that Jeffrey Hunter is one of those actors that really deserves way more credit than he gets. I like The Cage so much. I think it's such an effective blueprint for what came after it, that I have to give Captain Pike credit as actually my favorite Star Trek captain. He's seriously underrated. The question of Picard versus Sisko versus Janeway, most people prefer Kirk, but I'm just gonna come out and say it. I think Captain Pike is a way better Star Trek captain than anyone gives him credit for. Now keep in mind, I'm not talking about the Anson Mount version. The Anson Mount version is crap, totally breaks down Star Trek continuity. I think Star Trek as a franchise for 50 plus years really lived off consistency, where all the characters were played by the same actors, so it worked. Like, that was what separated it from Doctor Who or James Bond or all these British franchises where you'd have the same character played by like 10 different people. Whereas with Star Trek, it always felt extremely convincing and real. Like, if there's a Next Gen episode with Scotty, it's gonna be James Doohan. If there's a Next Gen episode with Spock, it's gonna be Leonard Nimoy. This consistency is paid attention to up until Voyager, where George Takei and Grace Lee Whitney reprised their roles in the excellent flashback episode with Tuvok, and that one's fantastic. That's a great flashback episode, and again, it reiterates that all these stories, all these adventures amongst the stars are taking place in one grand, unified continuity that makes sense. Now, you come to the 2009 movie, which is set in a different continuity, the Kelvin timeline, but that movie's ass. I've already been over how that movie's hot ass, because it's like, yo, let's keep following the original series characters, except they're different actors now, so there's nobody you give a shit about, and also the writing's way worse, special effects look like shit, and it's directed by J.J. Abrams, who's only directed one good movie in his life, Super 8, and everything else has been a complete waste of time. Then you get to the newer shows like Discovery or Strange New Worlds, where they're technically set in the same continuity as the original series in Next Gen and all that, except the uniforms don't look anything like the original series. Spock's a different guy, Captain Pike's a different guy, Number One's a different guy, and it's totally fucked up. So I'm not talking about Anson Mount when I say that Captain Pike is my favorite Star Trek captain. Anson Mount doesn't have shit on Jeffrey Hunter, who defined the character in a once-in-a-lifetime role, The Cage, that will be remembered forever, and should be remembered forever by serious Star Trek fans, and just fans of speculative fiction in general. So in this video, I'm going to go over why Captain Pike, I think, is my favorite Star Trek captain, and how the franchise has really done him dirty by just resurrecting his corpse, even though Jeffrey Hunter is long gone. Jeffrey Hunter died in 1969, so he's one of the earliest Star Trek actors to die. It just seems like the franchise keeps trying to drag him along, even though everything you needed to know about him or think about him was already said in The Cage. which as far as I'm concerned is one of the most perfect pilot episodes ever created. So let's talk about that first. The Cage is a master class in how to write a good TV episode, and a good TV pilot specifically. The premise of this show is introduced spectacularly right off the bat. I doubt a viewing audience in the 60s would have a difficult time understanding what the premise of The Cage is all about. We're introduced to the Starship Enterprise. We're introduced to its crew. We get that neat little shot where it zooms in through the top. Now, the version of The Cage that I grew up with was the version on VHS that comes with a little introduction by Gene Roddenberry and then little interstitials where he kind of explains the production techniques and the struggles that he had with networks. And if I recall, that VHS tape came out in the 80s as part of the complete Star Trek VHS release lineup. And that was one of my first introductions to Star Trek. I used to have about 20 episodes of the original series on VHS. And I don't think The Cage was the one I watched first. But I did have The Cage on VHS, the official VHS release, which was at the time the only way that you could watch The Cage, because The Cage had literally never been broadcast on TV. Although we'll get to that later. So The Cage was never broadcast on TV, and it only survived thanks to a VHS release, which is half in black and white and half in color. And it always used to confuse me when I was younger when the footage would suddenly switch from being in black and white, which are the scenes that weren't polished enough to be reused in the Menagerie, to in color, which are just the scenes from the Menagerie. Anyway, The Cage is a spectacular piece of writing. The sets are fantastic, the acting is wonderful, and Majel Barrett really comes in strong as number one. Between all the characters she played over the course of the Star Trek franchise, Lwaxana Troi, Nurse Chapel, and the computer voice, if you can count that, I would say number one is actually my favorite. Number one is arguably the strongest female character that's ever been on Star Trek, and she's literally a person with a computer for a mind, which I think is fucking awesome. You can tell that every single scene, her mind is just reworking and computing all these various equations, and that's such an interesting concept. It kind of predates Data or Spock. Even though Spock is in The Cage, he's very different. He appears much younger and naive, and he's only a lieutenant. He hasn't been boosted up in rank yet to first officer like he is in the majority of the original series. So these three characters, this pivotal trio, number one, Pike, and Spock, are at the forefront of The Cage. And then in the background, you also have the original Doctor of the Enterprise, Dr. McCoy's predecessor, who is also fantastic, and you can tell is one of those actors who is really, really crafted for the silver screen and the early days of TV when it was taken seriously as a medium, much like Jeffrey Hunter. He belongs to that same stock. I forget the Doctor in The Cage's name, but he's a fantastic character too. Rounding out the cast, you've got the original yeoman, who isn't Janice Rand. She's a different yeoman. She's a previous yeoman. She's one of the ones that's beamed down along with Majel Barrett into The Cage with Pike. So you have a fantastic crew, a great crew that easily rivals in any crew of any other show. And I often wonder what it would be like if William Shatner was just never brought on, and Star Trek was just about the adventures of Captain Christopher Pike, number one, Spock, and more characters could be added in later on, like in Where No Man Has Gone Before, the episode that introduces Kirk with his psychic friend. Dr. McCoy isn't there, but then later on, Dr. McCoy is introduced in the Corbomite maneuver. So you could have introduced new characters over time with this Captain Pike lineup, and I still think Star Trek would easily be a well-remembered show. It would be a very different show. It might have been a little more serious in tone. You wouldn't necessarily get stuff like the Mud episodes. You wouldn't necessarily get stuff like the Tribbles. But it would be remembered more so as an introspective character drama, I feel like. And it would be a lot more cerebral if it went with the Pike option than with the Kirk option. While many people just characterize Captain Pike as a proto-Kirk, and like William Shatner was brought on to replace Jeffrey Hunter, Gene Roddenberry obviously recognized that William Shatner's acting style and Jeffrey Hunter's acting style were extremely different. These were extremely different characters in extremely different circumstances, hence why from the beginning it is set up within continuity that Captain Pike is the immediate predecessor to Captain Kirk, but they are two different captains. If William Shatner is just brought in to replace Jeffrey Hunter, then they just call him Captain Pike and would pretend like nothing had changed. But obviously something did change, because Captain Kirk is not Captain Pike in any way, shape, or form. They are extremely, extremely different characters. I said that The Cage is a fantastic piece of character writing, and the reason I say that is because we get to know literally everything we need to know about Captain Pike within the hour, and you don't need more Captain Pike than what is given in The Cage. And the blueprint that he sets as the formative captain, the example of what a Star Trek captain should be, the principles that a Star Trek captain should ideally embody, he's such an influential character that he goes on to imbue the rest of the franchise with a bold spirit of discovery and exploration. And that's what's really interesting about The Cage. Many people don't give it nearly enough credit as it deserves as the formative building block of this entire half-century spanning franchise that goes on to have so much continuity and shit, but it all starts with The Cage. That is the necessary starting point. If you're looking to get into Star Trek, if you've never seen anything Star Trek, watch The Cage first. That's the entry point. That's where to get it on the ground floor. Then original series, then Next Gen, then DS9 and Voyager. You watch some of the movies. Don't go past that. Don't watch Enterprise. Don't watch the shitty reboot by J.J. Abrams. Don't watch Discovery, Strange New World. Don't watch Picard. I wouldn't recommend it. I haven't seen Picard, but I don't hear good things about it. So just generally stick to everything up until Voyager. Read some of the books, read some of the comics, read some of the supplementary material. But no matter what, you should start with The Cage. You should start with Jeffrey Hunter as Captain Christopher Pike, because this is the most pivotal moment in Star Trek history, and it is not given enough credit as such. So let's discuss what makes Captain Pike Captain Pike. How does Captain Pike stack up against the rest of the Star Trek captains? Each Star Trek captain has a slightly different worldview and approach to the reason why they're out exploring the galaxy. Captain Picard is a diplomat. Captain Sisko has a deeply spiritual side. Captain Janeway is defined mostly by her fiery tenacity. Captain Kirk, as he says in Star Trek Generations, which is kind of the summation of his entire character, he's out there to have fun. What defines Captain Kirk is he likes shoulder rolls, he likes battling the Gorn, he likes womanizing and drinking and just having a good old fucking time out there on the final frontier. But what defines Captain Pike? Well, The Cage tells us basically all we need to know about the character. He's a realist. When presented with the illusion offered to him by the Telosians, he accepts reality. He doesn't want to live in an artificially constructed place where everything is provided for him and he'll never genuinely struggle. He wants to struggle. He wants to experience hardship because he signed up to be a Star Trek captain, and he accepts that that's part of the job. Captain Pike is a realist, he's pragmatic, he is a great problem solver, and maybe the trait that defines him more than any other Star Trek captain is he wants to make the most of the time he has. This is just the result of the constraints of him being in one episode, but I think in retrospective media, what defines Captain Pike the most is that he knows he's not going to go on to be in 6 movies where he gets to battle with Khan or whatever, or he's not going to have a CBS all-access expansive show. Well, Ensign Mount gets to have that, but that's not Captain Pike. Captain Pike accepts that his one appearance is going to be in The Cage, so he's going to make the fucking most of it. And I suspect that even Jeffrey Hunter probably knew that his role as Captain Pike was kind of shaky even when he was filming The Cage, so he made sure to give his damn best performance, and that's what we see 100% every single second of The Cage. All the acting and writing and just fantastic production that is The Cage. You can tell everyone was giving their complete all to it to ensure that in some way, shape, or form this concept about a crew of galactic explorers would be picked up and continue in some way. So Captain Pike, more than any of the other captains, is a pragmatic realist who takes a systematic approach to problem solving and doesn't mind that his time is limited. He accepts that he is merely one entry in a long lineage that stretches back to Zephram Cochrane and extends up until Janeway, and he will accept his place in that. He will accept that maybe Kirk goes on more adventures than him, more thrilling adventures filled with outrageous aliens and wild shit, and Kirk gets amnesia and becomes a Native American for an entire episode. But Pike doesn't do that, and that's okay by Pike. Pike does not live for the outrageous or the frivolous. He just lives to live one day to the next, do his best in his capacity as a Star Trek captain. So that's Captain Pike's characterization. Captain Pike, unlike Captain Kirk, is not a womanizer. Captain Pike does not treat the women under him with any sense of flirtation. He doesn't want to kiss any of them. He probably wouldn't even kiss Uhura like Captain Kirk did when they're trapped by the Plutonian telepaths. And he certainly doesn't treat the yeoman in the episode like how Kirk flirts with Yeoman Rand in the original series, which is heavily implied. Captain Pike isn't into any of the girls on his crew. Also, he treats number one with the utmost respect as just like a total peer and equal, who's probably even smarter than him, and he totally recognizes that. When the Telosians beam down number one and the yeoman down to the planet, along with the girl who lives in the illusion perpetually, Captain Pike is not interested in starting up a harem with them. The Telosians tell him in very clear terms that they want him to start breeding with all these girls and make a new race of people. And Captain Pike is like, fuck that. I'm not here to play in your sick little experiment, and I'm also not going to flirt with any of my coworkers. Now let us the fuck out, and I want to explore the real galaxy. Fuck you. And that's why Captain Pike is such a fascinating character, because he legitimately, more than any other Star Trek captain, is legitimately just committed to exploring the galaxy with as much efficiency as possible. And he's not interested in discovering archaeological artifacts like Captain Picard. He's not interested in Bajoran culture or anything like Captain Sisko. And he's definitely not into drinking or flirting like Captain Kirk. He is into one thing, and that is exploration and keeping track of what's real and focusing on a very intense drive. That's why I like Captain Pike so much. He's really fucking interesting if you actually study all the little nuances that Jeffrey Hunter gives the performance. But I also very much appreciate that Captain Pike, as opposed to Captain Kirk, and again, this is one of the things that makes Captain Pike and Captain Kirk completely different characters, Captain Pike is by no means a womanizer. Even when presented with the illusion of the Orion slave girl, supposedly the most desirable being in the galaxy, he's not that into it, and he wants to get out of there. And he keeps in mind the entire time that it's all fake, so it doesn't matter, and he just wants to get back on his fucking ship and leave. This is fantastic characterization, because Captain Pike goes through an arc in this 1 hour episode that rivals the arcs that all the other captains go on, and I don't think anyone gives Jeffrey Hunter enough credit for that. Captain Pike, in the beginning of the episode, when he's in sickbay and talking to the original Doctor about his feelings and how he feels kind of pent up and he feels like he needs to go on an adventure, he needs excitement. And then, by the end of the episode, he's had all the excitement he could possibly ask for, but he wants reality. He doesn't want this manufactured, contrived illusion that's just designed to make him a guinea pig. He doesn't want to be anyone's guinea pig. He wants freedom. He wants the ability to write his own destiny and his own path. And that's a fantastic character arc, and it's why The Cage is one of my all-time favorite Star Trek episodes, a wonderfully written, self-contained piece of continuity that established, first and foremost, that Star Trek was going to be a series where captains get replaced, there's new captains, there's older captains, but they all fit into the same timeline, they all fit into the same chronology. And to think that Captain Pike exists in the same universe as Captain Kirk, who exists in the same universe as Captain Sisko, that's wild. and very, very cool. And one of the reasons I like Star Trek so much to begin with. And one of the reasons why recasting these actors, like Strange New Worlds and Discovery doesn't fucking work. And completely retconning the entire timeline with a shitty prequel like Enterprise did also doesn't work, even if you don't recast any of the actors and have completely new characters. There shouldn't be Ferengis pre-Pike. That's just fucking stupid. And also, the Enterprise that Kirk is on, canonically, at least according to the canon that makes any kind of fucking sense, is the first ship to be called Enterprise. There's no Enterprises before Kirk and Pike's Enterprise. Pike comes before Kirk, but there's no Enterprises before that Enterprise. That's fucking stupid. I've already made an entire video about why Enterprise is stupid and destroys the continuity, though, if you want to go watch that. So, how does the Star Trek franchise mishandle Captain Pike's introduction to the continuity? Because again, the cage wasn't shown until VHS came out in the 80s. It wasn't originally broadcast in the 60s as the first episode of Star Trek, which I think it absolutely should have been. If not at the very beginning of the run to introduce the world and its characters, and at the very least, all that should have happened was that the cage should have been broadcast somewhere in the middle of the show, say in between 2 episodes of Season 2, and there could have just been a little title card that said, "This is an episode that takes place before Captain Kirk was captain of the Enterprise a couple years back, and here's Captain Pike. He's the older captain," kind of filling the same role that the Gene Roddenberry special feature does on the Cage VHS, but just a little briefer and designed for TV audiences who aren't necessarily willing to sit through Gene Roddenberry's whole monologue about smoking or racial politics in those days of TV, and just want to watch the Cage. So let's say that the network gave the viewing audience the benefit of the doubt. I feel the reason the Cage was never broadcast in its original form was because people thought that audiences would be too stupid to recognize that the Cage happens chronologically before the original series, which is dumb because nobody assumes that Next Gen happens at the same time as original series. So by that same logic, nobody should assume that the Cage happens at the same time as original series, or that Captain Pike is Captain Kirk, or something dumb like that. And keep in mind, we're talking about the early Star Trek fandom. Even if general viewing audiences in the 60s were too stupid to recognize that Captain Kirk and Captain Pike are separate characters, surely Star Trek fans, who from everything I understand were extremely fanatically obsessed with everything about Star Trek lore in the 60s. They were like the original fucking hyperactive nerds who just obsessed over fucking everything, which there wasn't even that much Star Trek lore to chew on at the time, but they'd be like, yo, here's the Vulcan sign and all this shit, and start up all these fanzines and all this crap. So I'm sure they'd understand that Captain Pike happens chronologically before Captain Kirk. What was the solution that Star Trek decided on instead of just airing the Cage, the wonderful self-contained episode that it is, somewhere in the middle of the original series, or just before the original series to begin with? Well, the answer they settled on is the Menagerie, which might be my least favorite episode of the original series, except maybe Turnabout Intruder. I will hand it to Turnabout Intruder. Turnabout Intruder is worse than the Menagerie, but the Menagerie is pretty damn close. Holy shit, what a stinker of an episode. So, this episode is full of contrived conflict that doesn't feel like it needs to be there, where Spock hijacks the Enterprise, and then they have a whole court-martial scene, which is completely redundant because there's already the episode Court-Martial that goes into detail about how court-martials work, and we don't need another courtroom episode where all the characters are just sitting at a table and reciting boring shit. And it completely defeats the thrilling sense of high adventure and fantasy that was present in the Cage. Anyway, the frame story is that Spock hijacks the Enterprise, doesn't tell Kirk why, doesn't tell McCoy why, doesn't tell fucking anyone why, and then they get to Talos 4, and Spock is like, I can't tell you why I hijacked the Enterprise, but I brought Captain Pike here. Captain Pike, at this point in his life, is in a wheelchair, because he suffered a horrible injury, and now he can only beep for yes or no. This is actually, I will give it to them, an interesting direction that they could have taken Pike's character, that he escaped from this illusion, and then he's in a situation where reality isn't that pleasant for him. Clearly he's confined to a given space. He doesn't have nearly the freedom that Kirk does. He can't do all the epic shoulder rolls and flexing that Kirk does. He can't dance about. He can't do a merry little jig for Emperor Mudd. So Captain Pike, right off the bat, is set up as a much more tragic figure than Kirk is, and a reminder of the actual danger of space exploration. That's a fascinating angle that they went in, and I do think it adds to Pike's arc. But the problem with the Menagerie is not just that the frame story doesn't even need to happen, because Spock easily could have just explained what was going on to everyone and they wouldn't need to have a court-martial. He could have just said, hey, Captain Pike wants to go back to the illusion planet and he's going to live in this fake illusion forever, and we're going to take him there, and he's going to retire there, and he deserves that. And I'm sure Captain Kirk and the Admiral guy, or I forget if he's an Admiral or not, but he's some kind of bureaucratic official guy, would have been like, okay, sure, Captain Pike's lived a long life, he can go and retire on the illusion planet, and his wheelchair can vanish and all that, and it'll be fine. And we'll take him there, in fact. For the Federation, we can easily escort one of our dying captains to a planet where he can just live out the rest of his days in peace and retire nice. And Spock doesn't need to hijack the Enterprise for any of that. That's completely stupid. But again, when you're trying to rewrite and expand upon and add upon an episode as well written, as watertight, and perfect as The Cage, you end up bloating it and creating all this crap that doesn't need to happen and all this conflict that doesn't make any fucking sense. I'm sure it made a lot of sense to viewers at the time who were surprised by the twist about Captain Pike being taken prisoner by these aliens that can create illusions, but watching The Cage first and then watching the Menagerie, it's like the Menagerie is garbage. It's a horrible excuse to just rerun The Cage, but just with a little frame story around it, split up into a two-parter for no reason. And it's a shame this is the only two-part episode of the original series, because two-part episodes of Next Gen and DS9 are great, and do a great job of the two-part format, but this is literally just a frame story and an episode that already existed in a much better form, so it literally does not need to be two parts. It should have just been The Cage, rerun. The key problem with the Menagerie, though, and I can't stress this enough, isn't that its writing is convoluted or its frame story is messy. The problem is that it completely reverses and undoes Captain Pike's character arc and motivation. Remember how I said that in The Cage, the defining trait of Pike is that he doesn't want to live within an illusion. He would prefer the messy reality of his life as a starship captain to an illusion where he's on a planet where everything is provided for him, but it's all fake. So at the end of The Cage, what ends up happening is that the illusion girl, who's on the planet but is really the only living person down there besides the Telosians, is revealed to be like 100 flippin' years old, and Captain Pike realizes that if she leaves the planet with him, then she'll die, because she's too old and the Telosians can't extend their illusion beyond their planet. On the other hand, Captain Pike is leaving no matter what, but he doesn't just want to leave her there all alone, because that'd be pretty sad, and the Telosians can extend her life a couple more years, so the Telosians are like, hey, we'll make a fake Captain Pike that she can spend her time here with, and she likes illusions, so she doesn't mind that, but you can go and live your own life out among the universe with all the mess that entails. And so Captain Pike decides that's pretty nifty, and so the final shot of The Cage is the fake Pike and the actual girl going into the cage, and they just stay there, presumably. But now, in the Menagerie, it reuses that footage of the fake Pike and the girl going into the cage, and it says that it's the real Pike after the court-martial is over, and he's left his wheelchair, the Telosians have made him young again, and he's going to live there with her for the rest of his life, however long that might be. This completely reframes the canon ending of The Cage to the canon ending of the Menagerie, which is much worse because it implies that for all the years that Captain Pike was still exploring the galaxy and got in the wheelchair and all that, she was just completely alone on the planet. In this continuity, she doesn't have an illusion Pike because that footage, again, is reused. So instead of it being an illusion Pike, it's the real Pike. It never happened that there was an illusion Pike, so she was just completely alone this whole time. And the ending of The Cage is fucked up so that they can reuse footage of Jeffrey Hunter for the Menagerie. Which, again, they didn't have footage to reuse of Jeffrey Hunter for anything else. So they had to recontextualize the ending of The Cage in a way that fit the messy frame story of the Menagerie, and it does a horrible job because it implies that instead of being bound to his wheelchair and making the best of it, embracing reality in the way that Captain Pike would want to do, tragic as it may be, Captain Pike wants to go and live in fairy tale world forever with this girl he doesn't even really like, because by the end of The Cage he's accepted that while she's nice and she is the only real person down there, she doesn't really have anything in common with him. She's not interested in exploring the galaxy, and he wants to do that. He wants to live the best life he can while he has the life he can, which is strangely fitting, again, for Jeffrey Hunter, who died such a premature death at only 42. And it's very meaningful and impactful, this message of living the best life you can while you have it, rather than, I'm going to go down to Illusion Planet and live there forever. That just seems like a complete 180 on Captain Pike's entire character development, and it fucks his character up permanently. Is he still alive down there by the time of Next Gen? Like, what the fuck? This is totally messed up in so many ways. So yeah, the canon ending of the Menagerie completely erases the canon ending of The Cage from continuity. And in addition to that, it's just really, really horrible character writing and inconsistent with how Pike is set up in The Cage. It'd be like if Spock suddenly decides, oh, I don't like living logically anymore, this is annoying and sad, I want to start expressing emotions, and suddenly he just becomes a big barrel of laughs or something. No one would like that. No one would want to see Spock turn like that. No one wants to see characters that are set up a certain way with very clear character motivations and then just flip around to choose the exact opposite. For a more modern example, what Captain Pike chooses to live on Talos 4 forever is kind of like if at the end of The Matrix, Neo was like, well, what you've shown me is pretty sad and all, Morpheus, and I'll live with this knowledge for the rest of my life, but I really just want to get back into the Matrix, so give me that blue pill and I'll just slip right back into this comfortable illusion, rather than just kind of embracing and accepting the nature of reality. It's just like that. I mean, when you think about it, The Cage is one of the earliest examples of simulation fiction to happen, and the Menagerie just totally fucks it up, and I don't think we talk enough about this. The Captain Pike's character, who was a realist, a pragmatic realist who embraced reality and wanted to go on to do other things in his life, is just totally fucked by the Menagerie. It's really insane. But the Menagerie isn't the only way that Captain Pike's character has been completely butchered. Not only is the ending of the Menagerie now canon, but in the new Captain Pike series, Strange New Worlds, which, keep in mind, I haven't seen, but I've heard that in one episode, Captain Pike literally has a future premonition where he sees himself in the wheelchair and is horrified by what he sees. So not only does Captain Pike completely reject reality, which is one of his defining character traits, the embracer of reality, to go live in an illusion at the end of his life, in official Star Trek canon no less, but this entire time, the entire time that he's captain of the Enterprise for who knows how long, he literally knows that he's going to end up in a wheelchair and does nothing to prevent it. He doesn't avoid landmines or grenades or explosive devices. It seems that in the universe of Star Trek, it wouldn't be that difficult to avoid devices like that, he could just become an admiral and sit at a desk all day, or one of those pencil-pushing Federation bureaucrats that are shown often. It doesn't seem like Captain Pike would particularly mind that sort of position. Future premonitions like this are completely stupid. It reminds me of when in Enterprise, Captain Archer is exposed to like the Enterprise E or Enterprise F, or like an Enterprise way after Captain Picard, so that we can think of this backwards past captain as like having the knowledge and expertise of all the future captains and knowing exactly where the Federation is going to go in all the future centuries. And I think that completely ruins shit when you give a character precognitive abilities or knowledge that they wouldn't have otherwise, because then they won't act naturally. Like, why would Captain Pike still end up in a wheelchair if he knows he's going to end up in a wheelchair and doesn't want that? And furthermore, I find it insane that in a modern show like Strange New Worlds, we're still painting ending up in a wheelchair as this fate worse than death that's utterly horrifying. Like, Captain Pike sees his future self, who's just him in a wheelchair, and he's like, it's like, are we going to treat a disabled character like this? Technically, Captain Pike is one of the first positive portrayals of a disabled character in popular fiction, who ends up, you know, in a wheelchair, unable to walk, and you can just say yes and no with beeps. But is that so bad? Why are we still treating this like this is some horrible fate? Like, at least he doesn't live in an illusion. At least he's not actually secretly 120 like the girl in the cage. With modern medicine, not just modern medicine, but futuristic medicine like they have in fucking Star Trek, where it's shown that Dr. McCoy lives all the way to the events of Next Gen and the human lifespan is exceeded to like 150 years. Is it that bad to be in a wheelchair in this highly futuristic setting where medical science has progressed beyond what we can even possibly imagine, and there's a cure for everything? Much better example of a disabled character being portrayed in Star Trek is Nog in DS9. He loses his leg near the end of DS9, and he goes through a lot of trauma to cope with that and reckon with it. But ultimately, there's that episode where he just spends all his day in Vic Fontaine's casino in the holodeck, and Vic Fontaine's like, you've got to accept reality eventually, Nog. You don't have a leg anymore. You gotta deal with prosthetics now. But you'll make it through. It's okay. You're not less of a person for it. And that's such a positive portrayal of a disability in Star Trek. I don't see why Captain Pike being in the beeping wheelchair is still portrayed as like this horrible thing that's so much worse than living in Illusion Land with the Telosians. Because Captain Pike, clearly in the cage, fucking hates the Telosians' guts. Even by the end, where they've kind of made amends and he's kind of forgiven them, he doesn't like them for what they put him through. It is insane that we are still treating a character who should be as beloved and respected as Captain Pike with this frivolity, and we're acting like he should have an entire show to himself, when that's not feasible given that Jeffrey Hunter died at fucking 42 in 1969, and Anson Mount is not that good an actor, and fake-ass Majel Barrett, number one, has none of the traits that original number one had in the cage. It's just not gonna work. You can't make a show with characters who are entirely recast, because even Spock can't be Spock anymore because Leonard Nimoy's dead. So no one wants this. I guess some crazy people want this, probably people who've never seen The Cage and don't know just how great a piece of writing it is. But Strange New Worlds does a horrible job of treating the character of Captain Pike with anything approaching respect. So if you're wondering, this is how I would treat the character of Captain Pike within canon if I was put in charge of Star Trek canon and I was given the opportunity to give the character a respectful treatment. I would make it so that the cage is treated as Captain Pike's central story, much like how, for instance, Captain Sisko's central characteristic is being the emissary of the Bajorans. And while they might go to Meridian, or they might go to that plant controlled by the anti-technology cult that locks him in a box, at the end of the day, his central character trait is being the emissary. So Captain Pike's central story, the adventure that really matters to him, the adventure that really defines him, and I think this is already the adventure that really defines him, since it's the only time we saw live-action Jeffrey Hunter as Captain Pike, and it's really the only Captain Pike adventure we need, is The Cage. The Cage is the defining adventure of Captain Pike that clearly sets his motivations, his behavior, his temperament, and all of that. And it does a damn good job with that. But if we have to have expanded Captain Pike material, let's have it so that it's books or comics. We can have so many books and comics set during Captain Pike's tenure as Captain of the Enterprise. What we don't need to do is recast actors in shitty CBS All Access shows that only have a couple episodes each because we don't have the time or writing talent or production schedules that were available when great shows like DS9 and Voyager aired that were like multiple hundreds of episodes and fantastic layered arc storytelling that just can't be done on streaming, but can be done easily with network TV where you have to have an episode out every week. I've gone into depth on that before. I think the model that shows like DS9 operated within were way preferable to the streaming model where it's like 10 piss-poor episodes that are all really poorly written. So we don't give Captain Pike that treatment. There are so many books and comics that expand on Kirk and Picard and DS9 and all of that to a great degree, like more detail than anyone would possibly need to know. Star Trek has plenty of expanded material and lore, but there's barely any books or comics for the one crew and time period that would make sense, a time period that's interesting, but which isn't shown because everyone in it is dead, and Jeffrey Hunter died way too early, died way before all the other Star Trek captains, so you can't really do anything with it, but you can do it with a book or a comic where the characters are expanded but treated with respect, and their basic characteristics and motivations and traits are acknowledged and celebrated. There should be lots of Captain Pike books, comics, all of that stuff to cover and fill in the years that he was Captain of the Enterprise, besides The Cage. But The Cage can function like a full-on Captain Pike feature-length film. It's that well written anyway. It's up there with like the time element for Twilight Zone in terms of underappreciated pilots for great shows that went on to have a ton of influence. So Captain Pike goes to Talos 4, and everything in The Cage happens, but the ending of The Cage remains canon, and Captain Pike actually leaves Talos 4, and the Illusion Girl has to just stay with Illusion Pike and deal with the fact that her boyfriend is fake, and they just live there forever. Captain Pike goes off and has more adventures. That's canon. Now, Captain Pike, importantly, still does end up in a wheelchair, but he ends up in a nice senior position, in a nice comfy office, and he's able to run Starfleet from there pretty easily with his beeping wheelchair, because that's all he really needs to do. But he accepts it, and he lives with it, and he makes the best of what he has and the rest of his life, even though he's still in a wheelchair. He's still disabled. He still doesn't have that much going on. He's not able to go on all the adventures that Kirk is able to go on. Say Kirk walks into his office sometime and is like, hey, you know, you were a wonderful captain of the ship while you were, now I'm the captain, so on. And there can be a little exchange between them. But the Menagerie, in my canon, just doesn't fucking happen. And the ending of the Menagerie doesn't happen. Spock never hijacks the Enterprise. Never even crosses Pike's mind that he wants to go back to Talos 4, because he has horrible memories of that fucking place, and he'd much rather just spend the rest of reality, his life, with the cards he's been dealt, and accept it, and live the best that a Star Trek captain can. And then he dies an extremely honorable, natural death at the ripe old age of 157, and the entire ranks of Starfleet are there for his funeral, and it's just, you know, a fantastic send-off to one of the best characters in all of science fiction. Real predecessor and trendsetter in every conceivable way. Captain Christopher Pike, Jeffrey Hunter, the fucking Jeffrey Hunter version. Anson Mount does not exist within my continuity, because of course he fucking doesn't. He doesn't even look anything remotely like Jeffrey Hunter. I have no idea what the fuck they were thinking casting Anson Mount as Captain Christopher Pike. That makes no sense. So yeah, that's how I would treat Captain Pike if I was put in charge of the canon. Keep the ending of The Cage, ditch the Menagerie altogether, except for the fact that Captain Pike ends up in a wheelchair, because that is admittedly an interesting direction to go with his character, that he wanted reality, but then he ended up having to deal with the messiness and actual pain and suffering of reality. and that's okay, according to him, or according to how he's characterized in the cage anyway, and put in a little supplemental material in books and comics and other forms of media that do a great job of expanding the Star Trek universe without all this shitty recasting that just makes the universe seem sloppy and inconsistent. That's how I would treat Captain Pike, and I think I could do a damn good job. But ultimately, the reason I'm concerned with continuity of fictional franchises like Star Trek, Star Wars, anything to begin with, is because I write sci-fi myself, and I appreciate a well-constructed continuity that maintains consistency and keeps track of when characters are and what they want and what they're doing and so on. That's nice to have. I like characters that remain consistent. I like a universe that remains consistent and internally logical. And so I think that by studying franchises like Star Trek and Star Wars, it can help me become a better science fiction writer, to study my forebears, where they slip up, where they do good, etc. It's fascinating. Anyway, yeah, that's it for this video. Just figured I'd pop on here and talk about Captain Christopher Pike, why he's my favorite Star Trek captain, and why I think the current iteration of Captain Pike does him completely dirty and just ruins him completely. But then again, the Menagerie ruined him before that, so he's always kind of got the short end of his stick, which I think is sad considering the legacy of Jeffrey Hunter, who's, again, just a fantastic actor. I can't stress this enough. If you haven't seen The Cage, go watch The Cage. In fact, get on VHS with the nice Gene Roddenberry featurette right beforehand. That's the way to watch it. Don't watch it on any streaming services or anything. It probably doesn't even have the Gene Roddenberry featurette, and it's nice to hear Gene Roddenberry explain the history of that fantastic and interesting period of the show's history, because it really is very interesting. So that's it for this video. Me talking about Captain Pike out here in front of this strange material, and I'll be seeing you around. Sayonara, suckers.